Hello guys, Ancient Gameplays, I'm Fabio Pisco.
Who?
In case you don't know, I made a review or at least a comparison in between the 5800X 3D, 7800X 3D and 9800X 3D a couple of days ago when the CPUs were released, when the 9800X 3D was released of course, and lots of you people in the comment section have been commenting things like 1080p, it's 2024, or people that were just complaining that I didn't do 1440p tests because 1440p is the most used resolution nowadays. First of all, 1440p is not the most used resolution nowadays. The most used resolution nowadays is still 1080p. 1440p had a huge increase and will continue to increase over the years, of course, and thank God, but the most used resolution is still 1080p. And the second thing that you say is that nobody's gonna play at 1080p with a 9800X 3D and a 7900X TX or a 4090. And you're right, you're entirely right. And if you don't really mind helping the channel before continuing the topic, let me to the sponsor.
GVG Mall!
Bringing you lots of software deals like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2019 or 2021 with a new Windows 11 design, and for all of these you can use my SKG discount code for 30% off, getting a Windows 11 serial key for $22 and a Windows 10 one for only $15. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. And believe me, I do understand your points about wanting me to test at 1440p because most of you really want to kind of grab my information and translate my information to your usage. And that's completely fine. And that's usually how it works. And in terms of normal gaming scenarios and so on, yes, people with these builds will most likely be playing at 1440p or will be playing, let's say, at 4K. But again, resolution doesn't matter. What matters are the FPS targets. And if I'm testing at 1440p, I would be GPU bottlenecked in most scenarios. And if I was GPU bottlenecked or GPU limited in most scenarios, it meant that instead of testing the CPU, I would be testing the GPU. Because if you are, let's say, GPU limited in a game, let's say you're GPU limited at 120 FPS. If you change the 9800X 3D for a 7800X 3D, you will still have the 120 FPS because you're GPU limited. And if you change for a slower CPU, if you're still GPU limited, you're still going to have the same FPS, even with a slower CPU because you're GPU limited instead of being CPU limited. And when we refer to bottleneck, we mean that some part of your computer is actually limiting the performance of the other parts. Let's say that you have a really strong GPU like the 7900 XT, for example, or a 4080 or an XTX, whatever. And you look at the GPU usage and the GPU power draw, and the GPU power draw is usually lower than it is, and the GPU usage is, let's say, like 60-70%. That means that you have a CPU/RAM bottleneck. Meaning that it doesn't matter if you reduce the settings, if you go to the game, you reduce the settings, your FPS will be mostly the same. If you go and you activate FSR, DLSS, whatever, your FPS will remain the same because the limiting factor is the CPU. Now, that's why we test at 1080p and with the fastest GPU that we can get, because we want the limiting factor to be the CPU in order to see how much faster the CPU actually is. Because if I'm testing, even with this card, if I'm testing at 1440p, the limiting factor would be the GPU in most scenarios, meaning that I would be testing the GPU and not the CPU. And you guys can say, well, but of course nobody's gonna play at 1080p, they're gonna play at 1440p. Yes, but I mean, they can be playing at 1440p but have, let's say, a 4090. And in some scenarios, a 4090 at 1440p might have the same FPS as the 7900 XTX at 1080p. Meaning that if you are having the same FPS output, it means that in terms of bottleneck, it would be equal to test at 1080p with an XTX or with an XT than at 1440p with a 4090. Because once again, resolution doesn't matter. What matters are the FPS targets. Or you could be using 1440p, but you could be using DLSS quality or FSR quality, which would lower the render resolution to 960p, lower than 1080p, and again, would make the FPS numbers way higher and would push the CPU a bit more. So imagine testing at 1080p or testing at 1440p with DLSS quality or FSR quality would be basically the same. But now let's see some practical scenarios. Let's see, for example, Flight Simulator. In Flight Simulator, I wasn't GPU bottlenecked with the XTX, I wasn't. If I was testing at 1440p my XTX, imagine that my XTX, instead of going up to 200 FPS, would go only up to 140 FPS. At 140 FPS, all CPUs would have exactly the same result. All CPUs would be delivering the same 140 FPS because the limiting factor was my GPU. Maybe the stronger ones would have slightly 1% lows, slightly higher 1% lows, but that's about it. I would be testing the GPU and not the CPU. But since I'm testing at 1080p and I removed the GPU bottleneck, we can see the actual differences in between the CPUs. Now, you know that in this case scenario, for example, testing in Hungary or testing the X12 with high settings with an XTX, you know that the 5800X3D is able to push 150 FPS. The 7800X3D is able to push around 170, while the 9800X3D is able to push over 200 FPS. So now you see the difference because the limiting factor is the CPU and not the GPU. But if we go to a game, for example, if you go to The Last of Us, I actually hit a GPU bottleneck here, and that's exactly why you see such a small difference. Because if you go, for example, from the 5800X3D to the 7800X3D, you have a considerably high difference, especially in terms of 1% lows, which is really, really great. But as soon as you go from the 7800X3D to the 9800X3D, the difference is minimal. But if you test, for example, with the 4090, that is a stronger card, considerably stronger than the 7900 XTX, the difference would go higher because with the 9800X3D and the 4090 at 1080p, we wouldn't be GPU bottlenecked in this scenario because the 4090 is able to produce more FPS. So once again, what matters are the FPS targets, not the resolutions. Because there are so many variables. If you ask me to test at 1440p, it makes no sense because there are so many variables. Once again, I could be testing at 1440p, but if I enabled FSR quality or DLSS quality, it would be the same as testing at 1080p because I would have more FPS. Or if you're using, for example, lower settings, I'm using 1080p high settings, but if you're using 1440p low settings, in most scenarios you'll have the same FPS output as 1080p high settings, so in terms of GPU or CPU bottleneck, things would be exactly the same. So again, resolution doesn't matter. What matters is, yeah, you know it, FPS targets or FPS output. Now we have another scenario with Cyberpunk 2077. Again, if we were GPU limited, let's say that we would enable ray tracing, and we would be GPU limited at, let's say, like 70 FPS, with ray tracing 70 FPS. If all these CPUs are doing more than 70 FPS here, without a GPU bottleneck, with the GPU bottleneck, the results would be exactly the same, and all CPUs would be delivering 70 FPS. In this case, it is delivering 100 FPS. So if we are GPU limited at 100 FPS here, all CPUs would be still delivering 100 FPS. Now, if we were GPU limited at 120 FPS, what would happen is that these two CPUs that produce more than 120 FPS would be delivering 120 FPS, while the 5800X3D would still be delivering 111 or 112. If we were GPU bottlenecked to 140 FPS, what would happen is that the 9800X3D would be delivering 140 FPS, while the 7800X3D would be delivering 138 or 133, and the X3D, the 5800X3D, would still be delivering 111. And that's why the FPS targets are what matters. Unless you really remove the GPU bottleneck out of the equation, you will still have all those frames, all those same results with different CPUs, because once again, you're testing the GPU, not the CPU. And we can go further, for example, with ray tracing results here. It is exactly the same. Exactly the same. So if we limit the GPU to 200 FPS, all these CPUs would be delivering the same numbers. Once again, the only thing that would change possibly would be the 1% loss slightly, but that's about it. That's about it. Nothing would change. The average FPS would still be 200 average FPS because the limiting factor was the GPU. For example, in Counter-Strike 2, exactly the same. Let's say that your GPU won't give you more than 500 FPS. Doesn't really matter what the GPU is. The GPU doesn't really matter, the resolution doesn't really matter. What matters is FPS outputs. You go and you go to your MSI Afterburner layout, whatever you use, the Radeon overlay, NVIDIA overlay doesn't really matter. You watch your GPU usage while playing Counter-Strike 2 and you see that your GPU usage is 100%. And your power draw, your power draw is kind of hitting the maximum power draw that your GPU can use. So in that scenario, if you buy a better CPU, let's say you have a 5700X3D, if you buy a better CPU like the 9800X3D, your FPS won't change. Your FPS will basically be equal, maybe with higher 1% lows again, because your limiting factor is the GPU. Instead of having it at 98 or 100%, you have it at, let's say, 70%. If you have your GPU usage at 70% and you go from a 5600X to, let's say, a 7800X 3D, then you'll have more FPS because your GPU wasn't being fully utilized. But if you change the CPUs while you're having a GPU load to the maximum, the results that you're having, the FPS that you're having, will be the same. And you might be having a GPU bottleneck in Counter-Strike 2, for example, with high settings, but if you decrease the settings to low, you might already be skipping or be shipping from kind of going from a GPU bottleneck to a CPU bottleneck, because the settings are much lower, meaning that your GPU can push more frames and your CPU has to keep up. And in some scenarios, it might not be able to keep up, creating a CPU bottleneck. And in that scenario, if you're going to lower settings, if you upgrade your CPU, then you'll have higher FPS with a newer CPU, because the limiting factor is not the GPU anymore. And you might say, well, but at 4K the GPU is more GPU sided, and people will actually have a GPU bottleneck all the time, so the CPU doesn't really matter. Well, it depends. It really depends. And if you want me to elaborate more with new tests and so on, just leave a comment in the comment section, because I will try to make a new video with more tests for you to actually understand. It depends. You can still be CPU bottlenecked at 4K. For example, if you go 4K but you're using DLSS performance, or if you're using FSR performance, it means that your render resolution go down to 1080p, and you do that in order to have more frames. And if you have more frames, you're automatically pushing the CPU more, because the CPU has to work more in order to keep up. So, although you're playing at 4K, in reality you're kind of playing at 1080p. Meaning that, yeah, there's still a lot of people that play at 1080p. Or if you're playing at 1440p but you're using FSR or DLSS quality, yeah, you're technically playing at 1080p or lower than 1080p, because FSR or DLSS or even XeSS quality at 1440p will lower the render resolution to 960p, which is even lower than 1080p. So, you know what I mean. Once again, what matters are FPS targets and the FPS that you're looking into. Or even if you're not using the DLSS or FSR, let's say that you're playing Valorant with a strong GPU like the XTX or the XT, you're playing Valorant, or you're playing League of Legends that could run on my toaster or on my fridge. If you're playing, let's say, League of Legends, even at 4K, with a 7800 XT or even with a slower card like the 7700 XT, even at 4K maximum settings, you're most likely going to hit a CPU bottleneck and not a GPU bottleneck. So even at 4K, changing CPUs would show difference. And that's again why, and I repeated this so many times across this video, resolution doesn't matter. What matters are the FPS targets, because the FPS targets are the result of a mix of everything. The resolution, your GPU, your CPU, your RAM, your settings that you're using, if you're using upscaling or not, everything matters to the mix. And that's why the FPS targets are the really good reason, or the real thing that we should look into. And if you still don't get it, let's put it on an even easier way. Let's say you're playing The Witcher 3 and doesn't really matter the GPU you're using, the resolution doesn't really matter. If you're playing The Witcher 3 and you have a 5800X 3D, if you want to get 120 FPS, the 5800X 3D will be more than enough. You don't need another CPU, because the 5800X 3D will deliver you 157 FPS in this scenario. So if you're playing at 90, 80, 100, 120, 150, you don't need a stronger GPU, or in this case a stronger CPU, because this one can deliver the FPS numbers you want. Now, if you have a 200Hz monitor and you have a GPU strong enough and you don't really mind, let's say, lower the resolution or using FSR, and you just want more FPS. Now, if you want more FPS in that case scenario, if you want more than that, let's say that you want 190. If you want 190 FPS, to be slightly below the 200Hz, then the 7800X3D will be the CPU for you. You don't really need the 9800X3D because the 9800X3D delivers more than that. If you just need 190, this will be more than enough. So if you're playing at let's say 160, 170, 180 or 190 FPS, the 7800X3D in this case will suffice. If you still want more than this, if you want, let's say, 220, if you have a 240Hz, for example, and you want a bit more and your GPU can handle it, then you want the CPU because it can deliver those FPS. Again, FPS targets. And just to finish the video, I'll give you another example. Imagine once again that you're playing Assetto Corsa Competizione, or whatever it's pronounced like, I don't really know. If you're playing Assetto Corsa and you really want to have high FPS, if you really just want to play at, let's say, 100 FPS, 100 is fine for you, 90 FPS is fine for you, then you don't really need more than the 5800X3D, because the 5800X3D will deliver 140, 138. So if you are aiming to 90, 100, 120, you're completely fine. You don't really need to upgrade your CPU. Maybe think about upgrading your GPU first, because your GPU, once again, is the limiting factor. Now, if your GPU is not a limiting factor and you're aiming to play at 160, 170 FPS, then you might consider the 7800X3D, because the 7800X3D is able to deliver 172. And even if your GPU can't handle it, you can lower the settings, or you can use FSR or DLSS in order to allow the GPU to push more frames and your CPU to kind of go with it, so 170. Now, if you want, let's say, 200 FPS, and you don't really care about using, once again, DLSS, reducing the settings, whatever, you just want those 200 FPS. If you get the 5800X3D, you'll have 140. If you get the 7800X3D, you'll get 170. But if you get the 9800X3D, you'll have more than 200 FPS what you want, so you'll be GPU limited once again, because that's what you really want. You want those 200 FPS. These two CPUs won't deliver, but this one will. If you want to play at anything below these marks, if you're playing at 120 FPS just fine, yeah, then you don't really need a CPU upgrade. You most likely need a GPU upgrade before a CPU upgrade. And basically that's it, guys. That's how it works. And the resolution doesn't really matter. The settings don't really matter. What matters are FPS targets, and we usually test at 1080p firstly because it is still the most used resolution, and secondly because we want to avoid GPU bottlenecks, because if we have a GPU bottleneck, we're not testing CPUs, we're testing GPUs. Because the GPU is the limiting factor, and all the CPUs, unless they are really poor in terms of performance, will deliver the same FPS. So you should look into FPS targets. You should look into, for a specific game, what FPS would you like to have. For example, again, Homeworld. If you would like to aim to the 120 FPS, and if your GPU is powerful enough to push those 120 FPS, then yeah, these two won't cut it because they don't reach 120 FPS, and you would need the 9800X3D. But if you're aiming to, let's say, 60 FPS only, almost every single CPU nowadays, even in really heavy games, would be able to deliver 60 FPS, unless you're playing like, let's say, Cities Skylines 2 and so on. In that case scenario, yeah, the CPU would matter a lot, or some really heavy MMOs, whatever. But again, I really want 120 FPS in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and my GPU is able to do it. So, do I need a new CPU here? I have the 5800X3D. Do I need a new CPU? No, you don't, because the CPU is able to deliver 120 FPS. So you don't really need a new CPU. What you need is most likely a new GPU if you really want to upgrade. And well, guys, that's all for this video. Thank you very much for watching this video. Don't forget, hit like, subscribe and share it. Leave your comment in the comment section if you have any doubts, or if you still didn't understand how it works. And again, if you're CPU limited, It doesn't really matter if you use FSR to performance, DLSS to performance. If you lower your settings, you'll still have the same FPS. If that happens, you know that you're CPU limited and you need a better CPU. Of course, if you want more frames. Otherwise, usually you're GPU limited and you just really want a better GPU before getting a newer CPU. That's how it works. Again, leave a comment in the comment section. I'll answer as fast as I can, as usual. If you want me to make a video testing things more profoundly, just let me know, because I believe that I explained everything here, how things work or not work, because yeah, again, we just tested 1080p in order to make sure that there are no GPU bottlenecks for you to see actual CPU performance instead of GPU performance. That's it. Thank you very much for watching again, and see you in the next video. Cheers.